If this area and region becomes the strategic vantage point, the flashpoint for future security and defence threats and contexts, what do you do to create a common architecture? What does it take? What are the stakes? What are both the political, financial, and diplomatic efforts that need to take place if you are to create some form of common architecture as you look beyond into the next 3 to 5 years? I want to start by asking Tutti first, actually. Tutti, you've got quite some experience in this field in a number of ways as a researcher, senior fellow researcher. And the question I want to ask you, because it's set a broader context for this conversation, is that how does the dispute over missile defence affect Baltic security?
Although these Russian concerns, they have been mostly dismissed as baseless, but I think we should pay a little bit more more attention to the Russian perceptions, because even if from a technical point of view they seem baseless, the fact is that Russia regards its missile defense system as a threat, and I think Europeans might be ignoring it. Yeah, I guess I didn't mention the Russian concern. It's basically that the US missile defenses will in the future undermine its nuclear deterrent, and that concern might be baseless when you just look at the missile defense site that is being built in Poland. I would use the term strategic empathy, like you don't have to have sympathy for the Russians, but I think it would be useful to understand how they view things. Okay. And I just wanted to add one thing about this broader context. According to George Lewis from MIT, the number of the US defensive interceptors is going to be about the same level as the Russian strategic warheads at the current rate by mid to late 2030s. So I think Russia has some reason to be concerned, thinking in terms of strategic balance and so on.
I think we need to understand the context of the Baltic Sea a little bit better, because if we start to discuss this just from a submarine point of view or just from the point of view of A2AD and missiles here and there, it becomes way too easy. So I'm sorry, I have to complicate the situation. At the moment right now we have some 2,000 ship movements going on in the Baltic Sea, which is, you can think of that figure a little bit. It is quite substantial. And what are they doing? Well, they are actually transporting goods, merchant goods, to our countries, neighboring countries around the Baltic Sea. We are some 100+ million people living around the Baltic Sea. And we are just dependent on this sea traffic, that it needs to work. With the missiles, we can shoot from one shore to another shore. Then I think we need to, together, in a way or another, we need to build a common picture so we know what's going on. And we can do that on different bilateral means, or we can use NATO, EU, or some other cooperation that works, like Northern Group, for instance. And when it comes to the technique, I think we need to have both ships on the surface out there, actually looking after what's going on.
Thank you for broadening it and clearly bringing in that point of actually it's a trade and commerce route, and that's, you cannot undermine or not view the context that presents for this particular debate, and that having a common sense of what you might do in that context is absolutely urgent and prior to looking at other matters to a certain extent, because you might actually inadvertently do something you don't want to do.
When we look now at who thinks about A2AD, who thinks about warfare at sea, about how they want to fight, and who causes us problems, there are only 3 navies that really think in the world, and they are the Chinese, the Iranians, and the Russians. and they think about the concepts of how they want to fight. They break the molds and they cause us real difficulties. All the other navies in the world are obsessed with platforms and technology. They're obsessed with sensors. They're obsessed with communications architecture, with networks. And this is really interesting. And it's really clear when you work in the Baltic. Because, you know, as was raised, the Russians choose to buzz American ships in the Baltic. Why in the Baltic and why at sea? Because the sea represents a freedom, an area of space that is not governed in terms of national authorities. And this gives them the freedom to operate. So whilst there are Spetsnaz forces operating in the Baltics, and I'm sure there are some in Scandinavia who are letting down mobile phone towers, you know, all the apocryphal stories, they do it with more restriction than they do at sea. To them, the Baltic, the Black Sea, the Red Sea, the Norwegian Sea, these are areas of freedom in which they can test. They can push the thresholds consistently, and that's what they do. This is how they exercise. And the response from the Baltics, from the Scandinavians, and from NATO has been a sort of traditional response which has been very defensive in nature. It's been walking back. It's been to sort of harden its boundaries, to shore up its coasts, and not to provoke, because this is what everyone is very scared of. And post the Cold War, in an era of peace, you know, one of the things we train captains desperately to do is to fall back on their trainings and not to escalate a situation. And therefore, you know, the Russians at sea have a huge advantage, just as the Chinese have been able to exercise in the South China Sea and the Iranians arguably have in the Straits of Hormuz. So what does NATO, Poland, Sweden, the Baltic states, what do they need to do? I'd say the first thing they need to do is come up with an idea of your concept of operations, how you want to fight in the Baltic, how you want to challenge them, and what you want to achieve. And then within that concept, you shouldn't just fall back on tired doctrines of sea denial or sea control, of interdiction, because this will need to embrace, for the Baltic specifically, very different ways of doing things. In the South China Sea and the Pacific, you can have air-sea battle. You can use air power but not land power in the Straits of Hormuz. But here in the Baltic, you have a unique opportunity to fully embrace jointery. And that's not just air-land, which the Admiral spoke about, and maritime, but it's also about using space, about cyber, and about information operations. But you're doing this in a challenged environment already. You should have seen the news reports of Russia, which is already spoofing GPS within the Baltic, ships, commercial ships, now thinking they're 25, 30 miles inland in Finland when they're passing through the Straits, because Russia is skewing the GPS data. You know, Russia already has sufficient electronic warfare skills in Kaliningrad to blank out the radio frequencies from low frequency through to satellite communications throughout the whole Baltic. It can do it from Kaliningrad, and it can do it from a home. This idea that there will be some kind of beautiful connected network of shared architecture, of ships and land able to talk to each other seamlessly, is a fallacy. It doesn't exist. But this is what currently it's being based on. So what needs to happen? A new way of thinking about the challenge and the response to the challenge, and how the nations here and NATO wants to retake the initiative. Now, I would say one of those areas that you want to challenge is in the undersea domain. And submarines are absolutely critical to that. Secondly, you need to rethink about tactics. NATO tactics in ASW for the Baltic are wholly unsuitable, as are the joint operation doctrines that they have for here. Throw them out the window, you need to start again. And thirdly, I think you need to start training and thinking and educating your military leaders, because at the moment they follow doctrine in a dogmatic fashion which will lead to disaster and defeat.
The context is sent for this conversation in the sense that actually it's not simply about logistics and tactics and the investment in submarines. We actually need to have paused time to think differently about our positioning and have some sort of common and shared agreement about what we do with this area, but also not to deny the complexity of a trade route and a service route that feeds quite a significant number of countries across this region.